Welcome to the Johnny and Friends Ministry Podcast. I'm Crystal Keating, bringing you real conversations with people impacted by disability and exploring your questions about how to include people with special needs in your community and church. You can visit johnnyandfriends.org/podcast to subscribe and download any of the resources we've mentioned on the podcast. Well, did you know that this month is Tourette Syndrome Awareness Month? Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder characterized by involuntary tics and vocalizations, and it's a disability that's not often discussed. So this week, I am excited to welcome Chris Pearson back to the podcast to talk about the daily impact of Tourette syndrome on him. Hear how this disability manifests itself in Chris's life and how he's learned to manage his symptoms. He also has some great advice and encouragement for anyone who is struggling with Tourette syndrome or a tic disorder. Let's listen in. It is a blessing to have Chris Pearson in the studio again today as we celebrate Tourette Syndrome Awareness Month. Welcome back to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you, and I'm really happy to be here, especially for something like Tourette's.
Absolutely. It's great to talk with you again. And Chris, we've worked together for some time now, and I really had no idea that you face the daily challenges of Tourette syndrome. How would you describe Tourette syndrome, and what is it like for you to live with this disability?
It's a struggle. It's a struggle that I've obviously had to deal with my entire life, but It's something that, like you said, you've never noticed it before. It's something that you kind of learn to manage somewhat so that people, to try and stop people from noticing. So a lot of people actually don't know that I have it until I tell them, and then they start noticing things. But if I was to describe Tourette's, it's a disorder that involves involuntary tics. So whether they be verbal tics, which are making noises or sounds or saying certain words, and it could also be motor tics as well, which are the more physical tics, which is like movements of your body parts or doing something like action-wise.
Well, as you're describing it, I really had a lot of misconceptions about what Tourette syndrome is. I think what may come to mind for a lot of us is somebody who is exclaiming obscenities or maybe saying swear words or inappropriate phrases that they don't have control of. Maybe that's what comes to mind, or that's the stereotypical thing.
Oh, I mean, it's true. It's that's what everybody thinks Tourette's is, and that's because it's like
it's limited to that.
Yeah, and that's because its global presence is from these videos that show the most extreme versions of Tourette's. So it always shows the people who are, the most verbal, and there are people out there who obviously have that form of Tourette's who, cannot stop saying real bad phrases, or swears or things like that. You have people who will flail their arms around or do these really aggressive movements. But then you have people who are on like a milder spectrum of that, who, like myself, I would consider myself to be have milder Tourette's than that. Although to me personally, it doesn't feel like it's mild. But I think in the grand spectrum of looking at Tourette's is a little bit more tame.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, if you think about when I was reading about Tourette syndrome, I think only 10 to 15% of people diagnosed have actually that display of the tic where they're saying inappropriate things. And it's more common to make facial movements or arm flailings, as you said. But think back to when you were a kid. When were you diagnosed, and what kind of symptoms did you have even as a young child?
Well, I think it was probably around when I was about 5 or 6 that I first started displaying my tics, or my family had noticed the tics anyway. One of the main things that I think it could possibly be is the fact that I had childhood trauma when my granddad died. We were very close, and once he passed away, that was when my mum had first started noticing that I had certain tics. There's never been any definitive research that says exactly what causes Tourette's, whether it's hereditary or it's part of a trauma, or maybe it is hereditary, but it needs a trigger like a trauma for it to come out. But that was when they first started noticing them. And it's interesting that we talk about how you have the more extreme versions and the milder versions of Tourette's, because when I first started with my Tourette's, because I was a lot younger, you don't really know how to manage your tics back then. So they were much more extreme. So, whereas now my tics now are they're small and they're more contained. When I was a child, I had tics like I would do this thing where I would jump in the air and kick my legs back. And then I also had one where I would really whip my neck back as fast as I could. And then I had like ones where I would accentuate certain vowels in sentences because something about the feeling of making that word louder was like satisfying to me. And I also made like this kind of noise with my nose. To me, it felt like normal. It felt like that was just normal to do that kind of stuff. My mom and my dad would always be like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And the same with my brother and my sister and everyone. Like they would always be like, why does he do that? Why is he doing that thing? And that's when my mum was like, started to realize something was wrong. And then that's when she looked into the diagnosis of it. And yeah, that's kind of, that was where we went from there. But when I try to explain to people exactly what Tourette's is, like what it feels like you can equate it to two things. It's very similar to a sneeze. So it's like that feeling you get when you're about to sneeze where it just comes out of nowhere and you have to sneeze. It's kind of like that.
Yeah, like
and
it's
then
painful
also,
to hold it in.
Right. But then when you do hold it in, it's like the most unsatisfying feeling ever because you've held in that sneeze and you haven't let it go. That's kind of how it feels to hold in a tic. Another way to describe it is like an itch. So if you have, when you have like a real bad itch you can't itch it, and if you choose not to itch it, it gets more and more and more itchy until the point where you physically cannot not do it.
Yeah, you have to.
Well, that's what it feels like to have a tic. And it feels like if I don't let this out, if I don't do it, like I'm just going to explode, and it's, it's such a bizarre feeling. And sometimes if you hold it in for as long as you can, your body will just subconsciously do it. And that's that's why when you have the most extreme versions of Tourette's where people say these crazy things, you think, well, just can you hold it in or just say something different? It's not like that. It just, your body just does it, because you can't hold it in any longer.
Yeah. Well, and I can imagine as a child not having the same self-awareness that you do now and the same kind of like body control that you have. I just wonder, how does that affect some of the other kids around you? Do you remember being in an elementary school or even junior high and displaying some of your tics? What was that like?
It was tough. Again, for me, it was normal. And Tourette's is something that your family and everyone, nobody really knows how to deal with that. Nobody knows how to manage it. Nobody knows what the correct way to handle these things are. From my parent and my siblings' point of view, there was two different kind of attempts. My mom was very nurturing and very he has Tourette's and he, and it'll be all right and everything's okay. Whereas my dad on the other end of it is my dad and my brother and everything, they'd kind of poke fun at it in jest a little bit, into the sense of we'll just make fun, we'll make light of it and then it'll be it's fine. Do you know what I mean? We're just joking about it, you know what I mean? So it takes the stigma out of it and the kind of stepping on eggshells around it.
Right.
I felt it's a little bit tough on both sides of that because you feel like you're being mollycoddled on one side and you feel like you're being made fun of on the other.
Sure.
So you don't know your place in that.
Right.
And then at school, kids are ruthless, regardless. Kids are always going to be ruthless because they don't know the world and they just kind of, they say it how they see it. And there's been times where a lot of kids would make fun of me for it all the time. And I was recently telling a story about how when I was in school, we used to do these dance number things. So all the big popular pop groups back then, they all had these crazy routines that they do for their music videos and stuff. So we would get in groups and then we would all learn the dances to them and then we'd go and perform them in front of the school. It was a big thing in the 90s when I was a kid. So we had gone up to do one of those in front of the whole school, and I remember we're working through this routine, and then all of a sudden I'm doing the jump thing, we're doing the moves, and then all of a sudden I'm jumping.
One of your tics as a kid.
And I can't help it; it just happens. And then I remember looking into the crowd and seeing the kids on the front row who were pointing and whispering about it and laughing about it, and obviously I know what they're talking about at that point.
Yeah.
And then I remember coming out off stage, and I remember the other kids were like so mad at me, and they were like how could you ruined it, and and this,
you couldn't help it.
yeah, and it I remember that was like so, it made me feel a little bit defeated, and it gets in the way of everything, or it did when I was younger, and that was like a real sore spot for me.
Well, I love that you have a heart to want to create awareness for this. And I was reading an article that had such a great line. I want to read it. People with Tourette syndrome have long been misunderstood and mocked. I mean, that's what it makes me think of you at school. Underneath the uncontrollable symptoms are children and adults, human beings made in the image of God with hopes, dreams, and feelings. And another line from the CDC website, actually, it says, educating the community about Tourette syndrome can increase understanding of the symptoms, reduce teasing, and decrease stress for people with Tourette syndrome. People with Tourette syndrome cannot help having tics and are not being disruptive on purpose. They're not trying to mess up the routine.
Right.
When others understand these facts, people with Tourette syndrome might receive more support, which might help lessen some tic symptoms. And I think that's really interesting that the stress and the pressure can actually trigger tics. Is that true? Do you have any triggers for some of your tics?
Yes. So I have there's tons of ways that Tourette's is triggered. One of the main ones, which every time my tics are really bad, my dad is like, are you tired, son? Because he knows that that's a big one for me is when I'm tired.
And you're exhausted.
Yeah. The more tired I get, the worse my tics get. So in the evening, they're really bad, and they can be really bad in the morning when I'm tired as well. I think the worst times for me at work are first thing in the morning. I get so frustrated with myself, and that's because I sit there and they get worse, and then I'm making these noises. I'm like clearing my throat every 5 seconds, and they're just going and going.
Because that's one of your tics. I mean,
Right.
you talked about tics as a kid. What are some of your tics now?
Well, this is the thing. I have the same tics almost that I had when I was a kid. They're just way more managed now.
Okay.
And that when you grow up, you start to manage your symptoms a lot better. Whereas when I was a kid, it was these tics were so intense. Let's say with the whipping my neck back, I would really whip it back real intense. That was one of my tics that my mum was real worried about, because she's like, you're going to get whiplash, you're going to damage your neck for the rest of your life. And it was huge when I was younger, but then you start to manage it a little bit better. So then you can just you do it half as much, and then I can manage it to where I can do this tiny little movement with my neck that you would barely notice if I didn't explain it to you.
Right.
And then I'll work it into a conversation. So I'll move my head a lot when I'm talking to people, and in between all those incremental little movements, I'm just jerking my neck just a little bit to the point where I get the same satisfaction of the tic movement. So a big thing for people with Tourette's is finding other smaller tics that give you the same satisfaction of a tic from the original one. So, that's something. And the same with clearing my throat. Instead of when I'm in the car on my own, I'm I'm clearing my throat so loud that if anybody heard that car journey home, it would be crazy. So, that's when I'm on my own. But when I'm with people or when I'm around people, I just kind of, you can just do that smaller and smaller tone of noise just to kind of get the same feeling. It doesn't completely make it better, but it gives it a smaller version that it makes me satisfied enough. So that's one way that I manage them.
Well, Chris, one of the things I love about you is your humor, and you're a funny guy. And I've often heard that keeping humor in our situations is one of the ways that we can stay positive when dealing with a disability. Do you have any funny stories about managing your symptoms?
Well, I spoke just before about how when I'm in the car and I release my symptoms a little bit there.
Right, alone in the car.
That's right,
totally.
Yeah. So I think when I'm at work and I'm holding these things in all day, it's quite funny to me, I think. And I imagine to anybody else it would be funny from the outside. But yeah, it's not just in the car on the way home. It can be on my days off. So sometimes I can just imagine if somebody had some recording device or something for me in my house on my own, it would be the most wildest thing, because not only do I do the noises and the tics there, but I do them more extreme, because it's almost, to me, it's finally getting to release them, if I do them even bigger, it just feels that much better. So like, honestly, if you came to my house on a Saturday, you'd hear from outside, I'm walking around my house screaming and doing like all these, loud noises and all this kind of thing. Cause it's like this great time for me to release everything and feel a lot better about it. So yeah, that's kind of how I manage them. So another thing that is really strange about my Tourette's, especially when it comes to like a working environment, is my tics like adjust to the volume of the ambience in the room, right? So if we're in here talking and I can feel that level, I can like try to keep the volume of my tics to where they're reasonable for this situation.
Right,
you know?
so we're in a quiet room, so your tics are kind of understated. Yeah, okay.
So the issue with that is that I work in an environment where I am an editor at times, so I wear headphones. And when I have headphones on, I'm listening to the audio of the, whatever I'm editing, and that's louder, so I'm not aware of the volume in the actual room, which is quiet. And at that time, my tics are like so loud, but to me, they don't feel loud at all.
Yeah, because you can't hear them.
Right, because I can't hear them. So, people are like giving me glances and stuff, while I'm making these noises. So that is like a little bit of a struggle as well.
Well, and it sounds like you're pretty mindful about what other people are thinking and feeling maybe around you. I mean, you talked about kind of being stressed in the morning. You're tired. You're coming into work, and you work with a bunch of people in a small...
quiet office.
Yeah, a small quiet office. So how
great.
is it like in your relationships as you're managing your tics and you have Tourette syndrome? I mean, you're a married man, so you're working, you're married, you have a church body. What's it like for you?
People always think that I'm a little bit of a grouchy person. They always think I have that little bit of, like, oh, he's not in a great mood this morning or that kind of thing. But honestly, like when you live your life making involuntary noises all of the time, every single day, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, and like a regular person will come in and focus on their day, and that's that. 50% of my entire focus for my day is also spent managing my Tourette's symptoms. Wow. And that's exhausting to me. It's not just that. I also have ADHD as well. And that gives me a lack of focus. So now the little amount of focus that I do have is spent trying to manage my symptoms so that I don't make, a spectacle of myself in my own eyes.
Yeah, you're not trying to disrupt your coworkers.
Right. And from a standpoint of work, it's very hard. This is the first job that I've had in my entire life where I've actually openly told people I have Tourette's. And that's because...
Really?
Yeah, and that's because the clear in my throat is my newest tic. I got that about a year ago or maybe a year and a half ago. And it's one that's so loud that I couldn't contain it as much. So I had to tell people because eventually people are going to like constantly asking me what's wrong and do you need a drink or do you need this and that. And I felt like I had to say something because having Tourette's my entire life has given me the worst poor self-image in terms of like, it makes me really dislike myself, the fact that I keep making these noises. And I feel like everyone around me is aware of it. And I feel like they're, either making fun of it or they're just, even worse than that, I feel like they get fed up with it easy. Yeah, and
like they're just tolerating you or something.
and I feel like...
that's a horrible feeling.
Right, and I don't want to be someone who is just there and tolerated for, who I am, because it's tough. It's tough to be living in that. So then that's when you try to make your symptoms smaller and manage them. And, like... my mum will be like, your Tourette's have been way better, recently. And it's not. My Tourette's aren't better. I just hide them better because I want to please the people around me. And that internal struggle makes me so angry. It makes me so angry at myself. And I just want it to stop. And sometimes I'll be sat there at work and I'll just bang on the table because I'm just like, I'm done. You know what I mean? And everyone's like looking over like, oh, what's going on?
What happened?
And it's because this has been boiling over in me for so long, and then people come to talk to me, I'll be short with them, and I'm like, it's not because of you. It's really not. It's because I'm myself.
You're frustrated with yourself.
Yeah, and the same at home. Like, I love my wife, and she's the most compassionate person, especially when it comes to my disability. Because we're so close, I let my guard down a little bit, so my Tourette's get worse in her presence because I'm allowing myself to do that.
Well, for someone in your position, I think of how many of us are around you. Like, I think of you, I think how cheerful you are and how much I enjoy, like, hearing your stories and your laughter. I don't see you that way. And so many of us want people, especially with Tourette's, to know, hey, it's okay. You can be who you are. What encouragement do you have for somebody like you in that situation where you can say, hey, there is hope. There are people who care.
Well, I would look at where I'm at now. I mean, I feel like I speak about how intense and angry and upset and, and how hard it is to deal with for myself.
Those are real emotions.
Right. And but I'm here now. I'm turning 30 in a couple of days, and I'm here.
Right.
Like I have a really amazing job, and I have a beautiful wife, and I'm, in every aspect of my life, I'm happy in that sense. So I think that, like, my message to people who have Tourette's too is, like, don't sweat it. Like, you'll get there eventually, and it's been a real hard journey for me to find acceptance in that, and so I feel like you'll get there eventually. It just takes time. Now I struggle with having my Tourette's around other people, but really I sit there and I think, well, whatever, I am who I am. I'm still, I think, a nice person, and and I still think that you're
totally likable, and you're not reduced to your disability.
Right.
And I think that comes through when we look at you, Chris, who you are. And you said a good phrase, the journey of acceptance. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a journey.
It is. And, one thing that I'll say is, and this obviously applies to everyone, is in your life, go after what you're passionate about. And that's like something that you can apply to anyone. I would say that it applies to Tourette's, in my opinion, more. So my passion and my job is photography. And, I'm a photographer and a camera operator, so I do video as well. But those two things are some of the only time in my entire life where I can go through, if I'm during a photo shoot, or if I'm filming somebody, that my Tourette's symptoms my tics stop completely.
Wow.
Like, absolutely come to nothing. And that is because I'm so, like, passionate and focused on what I'm doing at the time that they just kind of sit at the side of that. And then, for that small period of time, everything kind of relaxes and that goes away. So that's why I think it's important for people to keep following what they love and their passion and stuff.
It's a good word. Growing up with Tourette syndrome and being in church, what encouragement would you provide to those who encounter someone in their church or their youth group that may have Tourette syndrome?
I would say that, obviously, being accepting of everybody is key to that. But I feel like, for me, it's more about not drawing attention to it, to me. Like, a lot of places, can say, like, we are accepting of this and we're accepting of that. But I feel like in doing that, a lot of it is drawing attention to it, and that's kind of unwanted. As somebody with Tourette's who literally every single noise draws attention to me, I don't want to be elevating the fact that it draws attention to me. So
that's a great perspective.
I think that is my take on that, but I do love the fact that, a lot of churches, are accepting, and I feel like it's more a congregational thing too, because it depends on how big your church is, really. But
that's true.
Like, if you're in a small church and you're making noises and all that kind of thing, it can be a little bit tough. But I think if everybody is aware and not drawing attention to it, I feel like that's a much more positive thing.
That's good. Well, and that just makes me think about going back to relationships. We have to know people. We have to know their story. We have to know each family. And I think in that way, you can bring the love of Christ to families who are impacted by disability, get to know them, embrace them, And in that way, our churches and our bodies will be stronger. So, Chris,
agree.
thank you so much for being on the podcast. I love your heart. I love your heart to share awareness of Tourette syndrome. And thanks for sharing your stories with us once again.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really glad that you had me on.
What a great conversation with Chris. I know many of us have only ever heard the stereotypes associated with Tourette syndrome, so I appreciate Chris opening up about his tics and the daily challenges he has in controlling them. And I certainly love his encouragement for anyone experiencing similar symptoms. There are struggles, but you will make it. It is a journey of acceptance, and you aren't reduced to your disability. Go after your passions and trust God to carry you through. If you have questions about Tourette syndrome or other disability-related topics, please visit johnnyandfriends.org/podcast to contact us. Our ministry exists to share the gospel and equip you to embrace all people regardless of their abilities. So we'd love to provide you with encouragement and resources. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Crystal Keating, and I hope you'll join me again next week as we talk through a topic that everyone deals with at some point in their life. The topic of grief. I've invited my dear friend Hallie Mastro-Leonardo to share her journey through the why following unexpected, devastating tragedy, and where she has found support and healing. So don't forget to subscribe and join me again next week on the Johnny and Friends Ministry podcast.